All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Laura Frankie. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator at HDC, and I'm really excited to have this topic today. We're going to talk about decarbonizing affordable housing, specifically multifamily housing in Seattle using the current code provisions. So I'm going to kick us off with a quick screen share here. And our agenda today, we'll do some quick introductions and do some level setting on why are we worried about decarbonizing, and then talk about how the code works in the decarbonization effort, and talk about how to get started, as well as some real life examples, just to give you some ideas on how to be thinking about this and how to move forward. Our great speakers today are Dwayne Johnlin from the Seattle Department of Codes and Inspections, where he is the Energy Code and Energy Conservation Advisor. I had to practice saying that. Sean Oram is from Ecotope, and he's the Principal of Design and Engineering and a Vice President there. And then David Reddy is a Principal at O'Brien and leads the Building Performance team. So those of you that have joined other events with HDC probably have some familiarity with these folks, but really a great team that we've brought together today. So very excited to hear from them. And Dwayne, did you want to make any opening comments here?
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. I'm representing the city today, and just wanted to say that this will not necessarily say yes or no. You will now know exactly whether things are a substantial alteration or not. But hopefully by the end of the hour, you'll have a better sense of what all goes into that decision and what you can do to make sure that you don't end up with any uh, uh, unhappy faces at the permit desk when you're bringing your projects in.
Great, thanks. Um, So just to sort of set the groundwork here, why are we thinking about decarbonizing? Well, the main reason there's multiple reasons. We like to think about it from a sustainability side and also from an economic and compliance side. So from the sustainability side, this is providing buildings with a way to decrease their carbon impact, generally through changing technologies and equipment that currently exists, which oftentimes results in better living conditions for your residents, and in many cases also provides for lower utility costs. So win-win-win. And then you also have the compliance side. So Seattle has the building emissions performance standard that all buildings over 20,000 square feet will need to comply with. This means that you'll need to be reaching reductions in your carbon emissions. And Washington has clean building performance standard that also requires compliance with energy efficiency. So even though some of those compliance deadlines are in the future, being able to be proactive is important. These projects don't happen, in a short period of time. So it's really important to get out ahead of it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our experts here and let David take it from here.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so as Laura mentioned, there's two main laws that one in Seattle, the BEPS, Building Emissions Performance Standard, and the Clean Buildings Performance Standard at the state level. Just to point out, projects in Seattle must comply with both, and also that there's a difference in metrics used between the two performance standards. Seattle focuses on greenhouse gas emissions intensity, whereas the state looks at energy use intensity. So we're not going to dive into that. DAHN has other presentations focused on the performance standards, and there's a lot of resources out there. But just to give you some background, one of the things that is driving you to permit some of these projects will be compliance with these standards. Next slide, please. Laura, can I get the next slide? Thank you. So just this section, we're going to talk a little bit about substantial alterations and the kind of two corresponding other provisions in the code. that can trigger full compliance with the energy code. And just fair warning, I'm going to provide code references and we're going to talk about the codes, but we're going to try and keep it high level enough so that people have an understanding of these provisions and at least know where to go if have your consultants go to kind of make sure they're familiar with the code as they go to work with the city. So moving into the next slide after that. So these are the sections that apply. We're going to talk about each one. In the Seattle code, there are definitions of the substantial alterations. And generally speaking, these are the provisions that if you trigger them, require full compliance with the energy code. But there are a lot of exceptions to them, and that's where we're not going to get into all of them, but just be aware that if you're doing any of these activities, it could trigger full compliance with the energy code. Next slide, please. Substantial alteration is a provision in the code that only exists in Seattle. It does not exist outside of Seattle. So keep that in mind if you're looking at projects outside. But there are alteration provisions, especially in the energy code, that exist in the state code, state energy code, that you need to be aware of. We are going to, just to note, most of the questions about when it comes to permitting a decarbonization project that are that need to be addressed in talking about a substantial alteration are what factors are involved in extending the useful life of the building. Criteria number 2 that I've circled here. That's mainly where the discussion will focus around. And recently, just in the last month, the 4th provision that would have triggered substantial alteration was removed through some legislation. And number 3 exists to trigger would trigger seismic and life safety upgrades, but not energy code upgrades. So we're gonna, in the context of this conversation, we're gonna be focused on criteria number 2. Next slide, please. So just recently, the council and the mayor passed some revisions to the definitions of substantial alterations. They include an exception for partial change of an occupancy, so less than 20% of the gross square footage, small spaces or buildings. And the most important one for today's topic is if the alterations are substantial, but are made to replace fossil fuel electric resistant systems with heat pumps, then those changes, generally speaking, are intended not to trigger substantial alterations. Next slide, please. Within the substantial alterations code, there are exceptions for meeting Seattle Energy Code. Not some may be applicable to your projects, landmark buildings, but you still do need to make strong efforts towards compliance with the energy code, seismic retrofits and small residential buildings. But again, that is just exceptions from the Seattle Energy Code, not the other provisions of the code that might be triggered by a substantial alteration determination. Next slide, please. If your project was deemed a substantial alteration and you did need to comply with the energy code, you have a number of options. One is just comply with it as written today. There's a prescriptive path that does give you some allowance on your envelope not meeting the current code. There's an energy modeling path that gives you some extra margin on your compliance, and then even an operating energy alternative, which in our experience is not commonly pursued because it does require you to meet a performance target in operation. But for some projects, it may be the right fit. I think of all of these, the modeling path will give you the greatest flexibility, number 3.
And if I could just step in there with that number 2, the prescriptive one, you're allowed to have the envelope heat loss be somewhat worse than would be required for new construction. But everything else, if you take that path, then everything else in the building, the HVAC and lighting and water heating, have to meet code. Whereas the number 3, you have your choice of what would be below standard and what's not.
Yeah. Next slide, please. So we're going to shift focus to this new, very important exception that was added to the substantial alteration provisions, which is to specifically speak to alterations made to done to convert fossil fuel electric resistance systems to heat pumps. In other words, decarbonizing or making your building more efficient. This is a big change, and this is, I think, where most of the questions that we've fielded have come up, and we're learning as we go, and it's taken engagement with the city to kind of get to an understanding of what this means. And the even if multiple systems, so for example, if you decarbonized your space heating system and your water heating system, you generally speaking, at least our understanding right now, is that that would not count towards substantial alterations. And one thing you do need to keep in mind is you would still need to meet what I'm calling the regular alteration requirements, which are significant. So it's not a total get out of jail or not have to upgrade your systems, but it does mean you do not need to bring the whole building up to code if you're exempt from subalt. I'm going to start using the term subalt here a bit. It is just short for substantial alteration. Next slide. Some other important updates is that even changes to the building that are needed to facilitate these conversions are also allowed to be made without triggering substantial alterations. And structural to support new equipment, mechanical for airflow reasons. Electrical is a one that is one of the biggest to come up on projects, and it could include a main service upgrade and not just new panels. And I think most recently, what we're hearing from SDCI is that even envelope insulation updates or improving your envelope with window upgrades or adding insulation, air sealing, and adding ventilation systems that meet the new heat recovery requirements would not also be considered counting towards a system for a subalt.
And I would say that you can see that whole list. Those are all things that you just need to do to make the heat pump system work, and therefore they've been encompassed in all of this. What the city, what's been the hesitation is that substantial alteration has always traditionally included also seismic and life safety upgrades and other things that are also critically important to people. So we just need to, but for this one, we're making this exception, saying, okay, we'll let all that other stuff go. You can switch to heat pumps and do these things that are necessary to make the heat pump system work.
I don't know if you see this question from Patrick. If envelope alterations are made in tandem with decarbonization, would those new envelope elements need to comply with the prescriptive code?
They need to comply with Chapter 5, which is the chapter for alterations, and that does give some significant significant changes to what's allowable for envelope insulation. So if you're taking this and you're not a substantial alteration, then look at the envelope section in Chapter 5 under alterations. It's 503 point something, and you can see what's allowable there. Like if you're opening up a stud space, you can fill that space with as much insulation as fits in there and call it good, for instance.
Yeah. One thing to note is that that other improvements that might be made at the same time should be discussed with SDCI. You know, if you're upgrading lighting or resiting or adding dwelling units, those all those changes that might be done in tandem with the decarbonization work, or even within a time period after you do that work, should be discussed and disclosed so that you're not potentially triggering substantial alteration in the future, or those components might put you over the line, so to speak, and being considered a subalt. So make sure all those other improvements are discussed when you're speaking with the city about permitting it.
You remember that this, what David told us 10 minutes ago, was that a substantial alteration is typically substantially extending the physical or economic life of the building. And you see that where you see a big gut and remodel project or a complete overhaul of a building. And it's a judgment call within SDCI that actually I'm not involved in personally, but somebody makes that call that yes, this is so much of a change that we're going to consider it almost like a new building. And this, what we're looking at in this slide, is one significant exception that we're pulling out of that.
Yeah. So next slide, please. So we're going to jump to another provision in Chapter 5 of the Energy Code that even if you're not considered substantial alteration, but you may be doing what's called a change of space conditioning. So in the state code, this is limited to converting an unheated space to a heated or semi-heated to condition, more or less, making a space more conditioned. Seattle has amended this portion of the code to include if you were taking a heated only space to being heated and cooled, i.e. what would happen if you added a heat pump to that space. So, just the straight line kind of requirement in the code would be that would trigger full compliance with the energy code. But there are exceptions, and there's some important ones, such as installing a heat pump with an ERV for the space, or adding cooling to small spaces. Now, not just individual small spaces, a lot of them, it's a total square footage, is my understanding. Is that correct, Dwayne? 2,000 square feet per building.
That's per building, right?
Per building, yeah. And we're going to talk further later in the presentation about code modifications and alternates. These are things, alternate ways to comply. And this is a section that, even if you're not a substantial alt, you should be aware of, because you want to find a compliance path for this provision in the code if you're adding heat pumps for space heating. There is another section in the blue box. Just be aware, it's somewhat overlapping. They both do apply to projects where you're adding cooling to a space. Next slide, please. The other provision in Chapter 5 that would trigger full compliance with the Energy Code, unless you apply for an exception, is change of occupancy. And there's specific changes that are described. Probably for this group, the most important one is changing from any occupancy to a Group R dwelling unit, such as an office to residential conversion. And that's where, that's a different application and criteria that could be enforced. And this is one where just meeting with the city, talking through what you're doing, and coming up with a compliance path is really important step to take.
We saw this just a couple of months ago. Somebody was converting some retail spaces that weren't being used on their ground floor to apartments. And so they went through that whole change of occupancy process.
And Dwayne, my experience has been the city is very kind of open to working with people doing that to find an adequate compliance path that doesn't trigger full compliance. Is that
Right. The the city's highest priority right now is getting more housing built. And in this current climate with interest rates and land costs and everything, it's tough. And so we're trying to push that as best we can. And we're also not letting go of our environmental ambitions.
so? I'm going to hand it over to Sean to talk about regular alterations.
All right, thanks, Dave. So this is the case of kind of regular alterations that don't trigger substantial. So just kind of going through, this is mostly chapter 5 here. And typically when you're doing alterations like any code, you have to kind of comply with the sections in chapter 5 around the kind of the energy code piece, as well as any mechanical or structural codes, just like you would new construction. And the general guidance here is, anything new, all new components really just need to meet the current code. So if you're using heat pumps, with some exception, you need to maintain, with some exceptions to maintain electric resistance or fossil fuel appliances. Um, so you're still allowed kind of those backup systems. Affordable housing and nonprofits are allowed to make sort of like for like replacement of fossil fuel and electric resistance equipment, but they must also provide a decarbonization plan. So planning for the future and kind of showing that this is possible and it'll happen in the future. When you're doing regular alterations, we don't the code doesn't require 406 credits or adding solar. This is not a substantial, which doesn't credit a full compliance. It does not require air leakage testing with multifamily, but it does require commissioning. Commissioning is super important, especially with any of this new heat pump equipment. You got to make sure they're set up right. Next. And so just getting into kind of the code sections for, the key Seattle Energy Code provisions for the alterations. There's sort of 3 here that we're showing: replacing any HVAC heating appliances. That's 4.6, 5.1's addition or replacement of service hot water heating. And then 6.2 kind of just shows the decarb plan. So we'll kind of look at some of that next. So addition or replacement of HVAC. So when we're replacing central heating, the equipment must be a heat pump. And then there's a matrix here that Dwayne's presented in the past, but it kind of shows, we've showed what's required when you're replacing heat pumps and the exceptions. Essentially just make sure you've got an ERV. But when you're doing affordable housing, you replace, with a heat pump anyway. But you're also exempt, and if that happens, you've also got to provide kind of the future decarb plan for all of these. So with the affordable, the decarb plan is essential. And then when you're looking at other types of buildings, there's sort of a 3 pathways here. You can replace all the equipment with heat pumps. You can maintain 50% of the existing gas heat capacity. You can also temporarily replace all existing heating capacity with gas, provided, I guess at TCO, 50% of kind of your outcome are heat pumps. And then there's this bond piece. I might ask David to kind of maybe explore some of that part. But I think the key part here is that when you're doing these, replacing some or all of the space heating, a future decarb plan is going to be required, and it's a really good idea in the face of BEPS and CBPS. David, is there anything more to add on that?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, the most common question I get is this exception for affordable housing.
Yeah.
Yes, you are exempt from having to put in a heat pump or post this bond that's mentioned, and I'll let Dwayne talk about that. But this decarbonization plan is intended to have you at that point do the planning needed, and maybe you might find doing that planning effort that it actually makes sense to upgrade the system to a heat pump now as opposed to wait in the future. So it's an important component. Dwayne, do you want to speak to the bond part?
Well, before I do, just look at that middle one that says you could keep 50% of your existing gas capacity, and this would apply to space heating or to water heating. Um, we've seen that systems appear to be so extremely over-designed out there in the real world that there's a pretty good chance that you could replace half of it with heat pump, and the gas would never need to turn on because it's just extra. But that would be you'd find that out afterwards. As far as that one on the far right, that it happens that we see buildings with 3 boilers that rotate, and of course they're the same boiler that have been run for the exact same number of hours, and they all fail at the same time. So yeah, you could replace everything, but in those conditions, you once again, if you're not an affordable housing project, then we need something to say, okay, we're going to get to that 50% within 4 years. And we picked 4 years because we thought for a lot of organizations, it takes a few years to get the financing lined up, and then it takes another year for the construction. So we said 4.
But again, that does not apply to affordable housing.
Affordable housing, you can just go straight to the decarb plan. Yep, and put in gas. But yeah, we're doing that as people have said, so that everybody's aware of whether they can decide whether they're making the smart choice now or not.
All right, and I guess the same argument here on water heating. So affordable exempt plus decarb plan, and basically kind of the same provision as we just talked about for space heating. I don't think there's much more to say here. I mean, it looks pretty parallel between space heating and water heating. Is there anything more unique here to add?
They're
Yeah,
all on the same path.
yeah. I would say the exceptions are there is language in the exceptions that is slightly different for space heating versus water heating, but the general concept is the same.
Okay. Um, and then this is kind of a slide that kind of shows what is a decarbonization plan. And so the city sort of defined this as, it's basically you've kind of convinced yourself that you can decarb this, and then they want to kind of see it, so they want to see your plan. So things that would go in there, does this thing fit? A quick one line on what it is we're replacing. Do we have access to outside air? Do we have clearance around ducts? Do we have place for equipment, structural modifications? So it's like really doing a full, feasibility around decarb. And this is a very typical kind of way to approach a feasibility study. Obviously, structural, electrical are a big deal. Partitions, any ratings in the buildings. You do run up against roof coverage and height issues when you're replacing small gas equipment with larger heat pump equipment. So you do have to kind of make sure you've got a place for the outdoor unit. Heat pumps need access to outside air, super important. There is the decarbonization planning form, and that'll kind of help guide you as you're filling out and kind of coming up with your decarb plan. There's also a schematic cost estimate so that you can get this into CapEx in case it ends up being an emergency. And then you want to kind of list your compliance dates for BEPS and CBPS, but mostly in Seattle BEPS.
And if you took as a kind of a general statement that design for an alteration project is about 10% of a construction project, and schematic design is about 10% of the design contract, then we're talking about spending like 1-ish% of what it would actually cost to do the work to just make sure that everybody's clear about what it's going to take. You don't have to do this plan. You're not obligated. Some future engineer might have a different plan, but it is a real plan that's actually got floor plan layouts, and the cost estimate is actually it's that lower level cost estimate, but it still has to be specific about what each major component is going to cost. So it's a real thing. I keep thinking that some engineering firm in town here is going to make that like a little cottage industry and do decarb plans for people for a budget price, but I haven't seen that yet.
Well, I would say it's also in line with something that you could get grants for to do through Commerce or Office of Sustainability. This is exactly the kind of work that they're looking to fund, and it gives you a lot of planning work to move the project forward. And that again is attractive to funders to have something close to shovel ready.
Yeah, if periodically some money pops up someplace, we see this over and over again, and if you're like ready to jump and say, this is our whole plan, we already got it costed out, let's go, you might get to the front of the line.
All right, I'll take over here to just real quickly walk through. This is more for probably architects and engineers, but as if you're an asset manager or construction manager, just to let you give you some background of how I've approached getting started with permitting a major decarb project. So the kind of order of operations is one, define your scope. This is based on the assumption that you're going to have a pre-sub meeting, which we are all strongly recommending to talk about your project, make sure it's not and get that early determination of whether it's a substantial alteration or not. And that involves scheduling a pre-sub meeting, follow-up, and moving forward from there. So this is all work that you do not even need that decarb plan necessarily, I would say. I think the decarb plan is something that would give you a lot to work with in this conversation with the city. But it can be narrative form, basic drawings. That's the kind of effort that I've found successful to get a early substantial alteration determination. So next slide, please. So again, defining the scope that can come out of your energy auditing or your decarb plan. Just a plug here, DAHN and OSC are developing what's called the Decarbonization Readiness Guide, which should be out by the end of this year, that can talk about this planning approach. And just basically identify your major areas of work, not only specific to the decarb work, but also any other work that might be anticipated in the coming years. Because again, that is considered by SDCI in terms of that substantial alteration determination. And review your codes. Like all these code provisions that we have mentioned are ones that the team should be aware of, know what the requirements are, so they can speak to how these changes fit the code. Next slide.
And especially be aware that there is a chapter 5,
Yeah,
which is the alterations section. We get lots of people coming in trying to use chapter 4 of the new construction things. Start with 5, and then it will refer you to certain sections in 4.
Yeah. Next slide, please. On the agenda, make sure you cover this information, description of the building. I've been including benchmarking data because I've found that is good for level setting on how is the building performing now and what are we going to be doing to it or why we're doing this to show that this work you're planning to do is a strong step towards meeting the building performance standards. Narratives, drawings, if you are at least showing what areas of where the work will be done. I've found you don't need one-line drawings and engineered drawings at this point, just a pretty complete description or narrative of what you're going to do. Again, both now and in the next few years. And then the number one question you're going to ask, at least I've asked, is this considered a substantial alteration? With the new clarifications SDCI and the city has made on specifically envelope related upgrades and ventilation, like those have taken some of the going into these projects, like questionable changes that are being made whether they do trigger subalt, but it's still really good to ask the question, and that triggers the city having to respond. And then any other questions about how the code might apply, chapter 5, chapter 4, whatever, you might, as you go through it, you can ask those questions. Next slide, please. You're gonna have to schedule a pre-app. I found there's multiple steps here. They don't happen. It's not like you can get a meeting next week. You gotta go through a few steps, complete a pre-app, get a construction number assigned. We have some contact information at the end for somebody who can help you move that process along. They really helped me out with a couple projects, and be ready to agree to pay this fee to have this pre-app meeting and upload all of the supporting documents in advance. So I would say, oh, go ahead, Brian.
Be aware that this is your meeting. You choose the agenda. You have the exhibits to show us. It's all up to you, and so get as much out on the table as possible for us to see. It's much easier than, we get emailed questions coming in and we answer them, but we're doing it without the context of knowing what the project is about. So use your time wisely when you're in there. Have your agenda ready to go, and make sure you get all your questions answered in one go.
Yeah. And I found it could take up to 3 weeks to get that meeting once you submit your application. But again, there's possibilities it could be moved up, but expect, it could be about 3 weeks. Next slide. On the application, make sure you check this first box and the energy mechanical questions box. That lets SDCI know that you want the person that needs to be there to answer the substantial alteration question. Next slide. And make sure you check this box, of course. These are all things that just point to guiding the discussion, or making sure the right people are there. Slide, please.
Excuse me, can I just ask that the person who's dialed in on their phone goes to mute, please?
Thanks, Laura. Generally, we found an hour to hour and a half if you're well prepared. This is a great opportunity, as Dwayne mentioned. It's as a applicant, it's your meeting to walk through what you want to present, discuss, and ask code interpretation questions. I've found in a lot of cases that question can be answered in some cases right there, but oftentimes they are not, and you should expect that SDCI will need to come back, especially on the subalt. You'll never get a subalt determination in a meeting. But in many cases, I've found, yes, that what you're proposing doesn't meet code, you'll need to submit a code alternate or modification, and that you can kind of come away from the meeting starting to work on that. And then you'll have to send notes in for review and approval. They'll usually found pretty quickly can turn around a response, and then also you want to make sure you follow up with code alternate requests after your meeting. Well, everybody's familiar with the project. Next slide. And I'm going to hand it over to Dwayne to talk about this code modifications and alternates. So we bring this up because it's a really important component of our code, in that it does allow you to propose alternate different ways of meeting the same or similar outcomes. And I really strongly recommend teams consider this and not just read the code and just come away with like, oh, we can't do that because the code doesn't allow it. This is an opportunity to work with the city to find an accommodation. So,
and before we move on to the codes, I see a question here from Becky. Who do you recommend attend the pre-submittal meeting with SDCI?
What's another choice you can make? You can request different roles. So if you are wondering about this whole subalt determination, then having somebody from the building code side, which we call structural and ordinance, and somebody from the energy code side, that would be good. And other people in particular, you'll probably get the person who's going to be assigned to reviewing your project. Um, and if you're not sure, you can have a little email exchange and ask, what would be the most appropriate persons if you're have specific questions.
And then maybe David or Sean, do you want to weigh in with who should attend from the presentation side?
Yeah, somebody who drafted the agenda, that can walk through the description of what the alterations are, answer specific questions. And it hasn't always involved an architect in my experience, but that's somebody who's great to have involved depending on the scope. I don't know, Sean, anybody else?
I mean, I guess it depends on kind of the scope and how the project's going, but usually with alterations or upgrades, decarb stuff, the owners sometimes want to be involved, and I've had a couple owners kind of join, so that's certainly another another option. But
On a recent one, which was disclosed as being more than just decarb from the get-go, but it's kind of come up, Sean, is my understanding, is the fire marshal and
oh,
as being somebody who might have some uh, say on changing ventilation systems in the building. Is that correct?
yeah, absolutely. I think with the current smoke detection, there's been a push locally to try to sort of mitigate or eliminate a lot of the false calls. And so there's a sharpening of pencils, shall we say, around kind of smoke control. And yeah, if you're going to trigger any sort of occupancy separation or use fire smoke dampers, then I would certainly advocate for getting someone on the Seattle fire side just to weigh in on where their kind of current desires for projects and smoke control are.
Good point.
Why? Just to make sure that if you're if you're addressing any issues or trying to um, try to make a new system comply. It's just making sure that you are fully aware of what the smoke detection requirements are if you're changing that. I mean, that would be just, it came up on one project. It's coming up in kind of current builds, but just making sure that you've got the latest kind of understanding. There's been a move to try to, like I said, mitigate some of the false alarms. But yeah, I guess that would be the reason if you're messing with any of the protected openings.
Yeah. Our fire department doesn't mess around for sure.
No.
Dwayne, you want to quickly walk through
Yeah.
at
Let's
least
go.
maybe get to the
So Seattle's kind of unique in that we're willing to consider uh, changing a code requirement where it still accomplishes the city's goals. You've got a better idea for how we can get to our goals that, say, you have a steeply sloping site, or you have some other difficult situation that's making it not possible to do it the way we want. We have it in the code. You can make your case that here you've got a different way to accomplish the same ends. You're going to get and we take those seriously and grant a lot of them, or sometimes not in the original form, but some version of them. So do give it a shot if you're kind of into a corner and can't make things work.
This is just the form you fill out. It is does require, if you have a design professional, they stamp it. But this is something that the owner or the contractor could submit as well. But you just need to have an understanding of the code and a good justification. Um, Then I think the next slide, Dwayne, I guess, yeah, speak to just how anything about the trade-offs or the compelling rationale that you're looking for, or the SDCI is
Yeah,
looking for.
uh, we're looking at this from the whole building perspective and the whole project perspective, and sometimes people have made a good case that um, some particular aspect is that they want to do is as good as it would be in if we're complying with new code, or it, if if some other condition has come up. So I can't say much more than that, except do bring your ideas in. And I remember a seminar I went to ages ago when I was still on the other side of the desk architecting, where somebody from the city of Seattle was up presenting, and he said, "Don't come in empty-handed. Come in. Don't just say I don't want to do this. Come in and say I don't want to do this for these reasons, and here's what we're going to do instead that'll make this a great project." And it's one of the reasons I agreed to come and work for the city of Seattle, was that it's one of the only building departments that has that uh, that's empowered to have that kind of flexibility.
I think we'll move into the examples now. We have a couple projects that have already done.
Dave, I'm going to interrupt you just
Yeah.
briefly. We've got another question here that I think kind of circles back to the fire code question. Jim Lazar's asked, under state law, the fire code is subordinate to the building code and mechanical code. Does Seattle Fire Department recognize that they are subordinate in the case of conflict?
No, we require that you comply with all the codes all the time, and it's extremely rare that there's an actual conflict. What comes up is that one standard is more permissive than another. In those conditions, you have to go for the more restrictive condition. So those codes are not in conflict. You can comply with both of them, but it might be more expensive than you'd hoped.
Jim, I see you off mute. Do you have some back and forth on that?
Well, here in Olympia, we've run into actual conflicts and wound up with litigation to resolve that the fire code is subordinate to the building code and mechanical code.
No, it's always possible to comply with both, and that's what we have to do. You can't and so we do not say that one code is subordinate to another. We say you got to comply with all of them.
Well, it's not yours to say, Dwayne. It's state law.
Well, bring us in a specific condition, but there certainly our fire safety is preeminent, and we're not going to ever allow anything that compromises that.
Sorry to hear that.
Well, I think we'll hand it over to Sean at this point for the first example.
Right. All right. So this is an upgrade to an existing building. This is called Bayview Apartments in downtown Seattle. It's owned by Seattle Housing Authority. There were two upgrades specific here. So SHA has a big picture agenda to decarbonize a lot of their or all of their buildings, and so this was sort of a particular building to go after. So in this particular, so we started this in 2020, and the upgrades were completed in 23. There's two basic measures here. One was conversion of a central electric water heating to a central heat pump water heater. The second upgrade here was heat recovery ventilation. This was looking at apartment unit exhaust, trying to recover that heat into the existing corridor gas heated supply ventilation. Those are the basic scopes here. Next. So just kind of summarizing the Bayview, the original electric DHW system was a COP01. It was an electric resistance system. This building was built in 76, 100 units, 14 stories. The hot water heating system went from a COP01 to a COP 2.6. This was also a project where we kind of showcased a factory built option. The entire system was switched over in about 3 hours. So barely any disruption. So this was a pretty successful project. We're now looking at doing some more experiments with that particular heat pump around load shifting. So this is installed and operating. And then next, the other thing I would say, go back real quick. The existing electric system is kind of shown at the right, and that was what was there. We replaced the electrical and turned that into the swing tank, and then we put the heat pumps outside with some more storage. So that kind of shows you can kind of see a skid, and it's added to the existing system. And so the existing hot water plant was valved up to accept this skid, and so the whole kind of switch over happened over middle of the night. Anyway, let's go to the next slide. And then I want to talk about the heat recovery ventilation. So this is, currently what was there when we arrived. It's a typical kind of high-rise ventilation shaft. So you've got exhaust ducts in all the residential units, coming up through subducts out to rooftop fans. That particular fan that was installed here was very oversized. And so part of the scope here was to reduce that fan and put it on variable speed pressure. And then also try to take some of that exhaust air out of the residential units, recover that heat, and use it to heat up the corridor supply air, which is currently being used, using gas to provide the space conditioning there. One thing to point out is this shaft was actually partitioned. There's a kitchen side and a bathroom side. So this is a 14-story high-rise, but you can see that the shaft is actually partitioned. It was built that way. It's important for what's next. Okay, and the next slide. You can kind of see what happened. So the fans on the top were about 5 feet tall. They were 5x the flow that was needed in all the apartments. And so the retrofit was we put a much smaller fan on, and then we extended the partition in the duct up and around and pulled off the non-kitchen side of the exhaust and put that into an ERV, which is then used to supply or temper air for the corridor system. That fan at the top runs on pressure. It runs just enough to maintain 0.05 or so above the shaft to maintain positive flow in all the units. There's a huge stack effect here, so we get a huge boost of airflow naturally. Next. This is like getting into the weeds a little bit about how the heat recovery was performed. So we're just pulling out of the bathroom groups. The kitchen exhaust was left it's not range exhaust, it's just kitchen room exhaust, continuous. And then the heat recovery happens. There's a couple shafts that go to a single unit, but that's kind of the schematic of what was there. Next. And then here's the results. So originally this building was running an EUI of about 37, and after the hot water was replaced with a COP 2.6 heat pump and the heat recovery ventilation was implemented, you can kind of see the project kind of stage in over the years, and just 2024 the UI is now 27. So that's a 37 to 27 reduction. Over to the right is kind of the utility cost savings. But that's kind of the results here on that thing. And then in terms of kind of the relative to what we're talking about today, so the hot water system was existing electric, replaced that with a heat pump, pretty straightforward. And then the ventilation system, that's just that heat recovery happened. There was no impact to the inside systems. All the work was done outside of the envelope up on the roof. And this was permitted in 21. Okay, next. I'll hand that back over to David.
Thanks, Sean.
Yep.
Yeah, so just two more slides here. Denny Park is a development that is in South Lake Union, and it's in the current stage is just past feasibility. Basically, we outlined the scope of a number of measures to decarbonize the building. We met with City of Seattle to describe the program through the whole process we described and determined it was not a substantial alteration. This was kind of before the recent legislation to codify some of the changes that have happened, but it's as you can see, we did some modeling to demonstrate the impact of all the measures that will be done, and cumulatively they will all bring the building into compliance with BEPS, which is kind of what we had mentioned in the beginning to drive or is driving a lot of this work. Next slide. And 1811 Eastlake is a permanent supportive housing development, again in South Lake Union area. This was even more substantial, major significant upgrades, conversion from a hot water heat system to a two-pipe heating and cooling hydronic loop, new heat pump water heating, replacing the roof with insulation, lighting, controls, ERVs for the apartments. Very significant scope, all presented to SDCI and determined not a substantial alteration. And again, bringing it all within compliance of BEPS. So those are just two examples. This shows, what we're talking about here. I'll hand it over to Dwayne if you want to make any last comments. I would highlight Andy's contact here. Information can help answer questions and facilitate scheduling on these. He did help me out. It was very helpful.
So just a few parting shots here. Basically, things that are new going into your building have to meet code. New windows, new water heaters, whatever. Existing stuff can most of the time, with very few exceptions, can just stay there forever. But we've already talked about the pre-sub conference. That's less than $1,000, and you're going to save way more than that by making sure that you got all those things worked out. Notice that with heat pump water heaters, there's 3 separate permits that are needed, and sometimes an electrical permit as well. So make sure that your engineer's clear about all the applications that have to be made. There's an exception in there in the code for alterations that you don't typically have to do C406 credits or solar if you're just if it's just a simple alteration and not a subalt. And finally, for most alterations, air leakage testing is not required either. Okay, you'll find those in the code. But otherwise, I think we're past our minute, aren't we?
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, we're 1 minute over. So if anybody has any questions that they want to still have answered, feel free to pop yourself off of mute. Otherwise, we'll wrap up here. But I want to thank the group. This has been a really meaningful conversation today, and I'm sure folks will get a lot out of the slides for a long time to come when we circulate them around. Any parting remarks from the team?
Please get in touch. More questions, things that weren't answered here. Happy to help out.
Yep.
All right. Thank you all for attending today, and we'll be in touch with the follow-up slides and recording.
Great. Thanks for joining. Bye now.
Thanks.